Morning settled over the mountain range in layers of pale mist, soft enough to blur the line between the trees and the sky. Sunlight filtered through the towering pines in thin golden shafts, illuminating drifting pollen and tiny insects that floated lazily in the cool air. The forest was alive, a half not with noise, but with rhythm. Birds called from hidden branches. Leaves whispered as the breeze threaded its way through the canopy. Somewhere farther downhill, water rolled steadily over stone. To most people, it was simply another forest. To Dr. Evelyn Rowan, it was an encyclopedia. She paused beside a cluster of broad green leaves emerging from the damp earth. Kneeling, she brushed away a layer of fallen needles with practiced fingers. "Notice the serrated margins," she said without looking up. A chorus of footsteps stopped behind her. 7 university students gathered around, hiking packs shifting against tired shoulders. "What species?" Evelyn asked. Silence lingered. Finally, one student ventured an answer. "False hellebore." Evelyn smiled. "Good observation. Similar shape." She pinched one leaf gently between her fingers. "But look closer." The students leaned in. "The veins run differently. The stem emerges from a rhizome rather than a bulb, and the new shoots curl inward before opening." She stood and stepped aside. "This is Solomon's seal." Several students scribbled into waterproof notebooks. "It has medicinal uses," she continued. "The roots have been used traditionally for inflammation, though they require proper preparation. Misidentify this in the wild, and you'll either waste valuable energy or poison yourself." One student laughed nervously. "So basically, don't eat anything unless you're with you." Evelyn chuckled. "I'd rather teach you not to need me." That had always been her philosophy. Knowledge wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to keep people alive. The annual field expedition had become something of a tradition at Westbridge University. Every spring, Evelyn led a week-long botanical survey through Black Alder National Forest, documenting native plant populations and teaching students how ecosystems functioned beyond laboratory walls. Most professors carried tablets. Evelyn carried a weathered leather notebook. Inside were 20 years of observations. Bloom cycles, fungal networks, medicinal herbs, soil conditions, rainfall patterns. The notebook had survived rivers, storms, and one curious black bear. She trusted it more than cloud storage. As the students spread out to collect samples, Evelyn wandered toward a moss-covered log where brilliant orange fungi climbed the decaying wood like tiny shelves. She photographed them before carefully recording their location. Decay. Most people feared it. Nature depended on it. Without decay, forests suffocated beneath their own dead. Without fungi recycling nutrients, new life never emerged. Death, she often reminded her students, wasn't the opposite of life. It was part of it. By midday, clouds drifted overhead. The temperature cooled. Lunch consisted of trail mix, dried fruit, and laughter around a small clearing. Evelyn sat slightly apart, reviewing specimens while sipping from a steel bottle. Her phone buzzed. 1 bar of reception. A message from her department chair appeared. "Call me when you're back in range." No explanation. She frowned. The message timestamp showed it had been sent nearly 4 hours earlier. Odd. Normally, the university respected the expedition schedule. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. No point worrying about something she couldn't reach. Around 1 o'clock, the birds stopped singing. It happened gradually enough that no one noticed. Except Evelyn. She lifted her head. Silence. Complete silence. The forest hadn't become quiet. It had become cautious. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. She scanned the trees. Nothing. No movement. No obvious predator. Still. Something felt wrong. Years of working outdoors had taught her to trust changes that couldn't yet be explained. "Everyone," she called. The students looked up. "We're moving." One raised an eyebrow. "But we're ahead of schedule." "I know. Did something happen?" Evelyn listened again. Nothing. I'd just rather reach camp earlier. No one argued. The trail curved along a rocky ridgeline overlooking the valley. Normally, the view stretched for miles. Today, smoke. Thin gray columns rose from somewhere beyond the distant hills. One student pointed. Wildfire. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. Too many separate plumes. Too spread out. Not one fire, many. She reached for her binoculars. The city shimmered on the horizon. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then, half a helicopter tilted sharply. Its tail spun. Within seconds, it disappeared behind the skyline. A plume of black smoke followed. No one spoke. Another student finally whispered, "Did that crash?" "Aye." Evelyn lowered the binoculars. "I think it did." The forest suddenly felt much farther from civilization than it had that morning. They reached the ranger station shortly before 3. Or what remained of it. The front door hung open. A pickup truck sat crooked against a fence. Its driver's door stood open. Keys still dangling from the ignition. Coffee had spilled across the dashboard and dried in the afternoon sun. No people. No ranger. No radio chatter, nothing. The silence pressed against them. One student laughed uneasily. "This is getting creepy." Evelyn stepped inside. Maps littered the floor. A chair lay overturned. A mug had shattered near the reception desk. None of it looked old. It looked interrupted, as though everyone had simply stopped whatever they were doing. Without warning, she found the emergency radio, static. Nothing but static. Senia half, avoid. Infected. The words crackled so faintly, she wasn't certain she'd heard them. Another burst. Do not approach. More static, bite. Silence. Her stomach tightened. Infected. Behind her, one of the students asked, "What did it say?" Before Evelyn could answer, half a scream echoed through the forest. Close. Far too close. Everyone froze. Another scream. This one ended abruptly, cut off. Not fading, stopping. The students stared toward the trees. No birds took flight. No animals ran. Only silence answered. Then came something worse. Footsteps. Many footsteps. Not running. Stumbling. Branches snapped. Leaves rustled. Something a half or several things a half were moving toward the ranger station. Slowly. Evelyn felt every instinct sharpen at once. Her pulse quickened, but her thoughts remained clear. She looked at her students. Leave your sample bags. Confused faces. Now, what? Move. There was no fear in her voice. Only certainty. Sometimes certainty was more frightening than panic. The nearest student dropped his equipment. The others followed. The footsteps grew louder. One figure emerged between the trees. Then another. Then a third. They walked strangely. Limbs stiff. Heads hanging at impossible angles. Their clothes were soaked with dried blood. One of them wore a park ranger uniform. Evelyn's breath caught. The ranger lifted his head. His eyes were clouded. His jaw hung partially open. Dark blood coated his chin. He took one slow step forward. Then another. Behind him, more shapes appeared between the trees. Too many to count. Evelyn whispered only 2 words, "Run." No one moved. Not at first. Fear had a way of freezing people before it ever made them run. The students stood rooted to the gravel outside the ranger station, their eyes locked on the staggering figures emerging from the trees. The former ranger lurched forward another step. His boots scraped over loose stone with a dry, dragging sound. His left arm hung uselessly against his side, bent at an angle no living joint should allow. Blood had dried into thick black streaks across the front of his uniform. Flies circled lazily around the wounds on his neck. "Evelyn," whispered Mia, one of the graduate students. "What's wrong with him?" "I don't know." It wasn't entirely true. She knew one thing. No living person should still be standing after injuries like that. The ranger lifted his head. His cloudy eyes settled on the group. Then his mouth opened. Not to speak, to growl. It was low, animal. The sound carried through the clearing, and was answered almost immediately by similar noises from deeper within the forest. More figures appeared, 5, 8, 12. Some stumbled over roots before regaining their balance. Others walked with an unsettling steadiness, despite obvious broken bones. None of them looked at one another. Every face pointed toward the students. Toward fresh movement. Toward life. Evelyn's pulse hammered against her ribs. Run. She shouted. This time, everyone obeyed. The trail erupted into chaos. Backpacks bounced violently as students sprinted uphill, branches whipping against their arms and faces. Someone lost a water bottle. Another dropped a camera that shattered against exposed rock. No one stopped to retrieve anything. Evelyn ran near the rear of the group. Not because she was slow, because someone had to watch behind them. The infected had accelerated. They no longer wandered. They chased. Their movements were awkward but relentless, stumbling over fallen logs and crashing through undergrowth with reckless determination. Pain no longer slowed them. Fatigue no longer mattered. A scream echoed ahead. One student had slipped crossing a narrow stream. He scrambled to his feet, but 2 infected had already reached the bank. Help! Evelyn didn't hesitate. She grabbed a fallen pine branch thicker than her wrist and swung with every ounce of strength she possessed. The branch cracked across the first attacker's temple. The impact barely slowed it. The second lunged. Its fingers grazed the student's backpack before Evelyn shoved him sideways. Move! The branch splintered on her second strike. She grabbed the student by his shoulder. Run! They climbed the opposite bank together. Behind them, the infected splashed into the water without concern for the slippery rocks beneath their feet. The forest became a maze. Trails disappeared beneath dense ferns. Steep slopes forced the group into single file. Someone shouted directions. Someone else insisted they had gone the wrong way. Panic fractured the orderly discipline of the expedition. Evelyn fought to keep everyone together. Stay where you can see each other. A crash erupted to her right. An infected burst through a wall of young birch saplings. Too close. It reached toward Daniel, the youngest student. Daniel froze. Evelyn yanked him backward by his backpack straps. The creature's fingers closed on empty air. She shoved Daniel downhill. Keep moving. What are they? I don't know. It was the truth she hated most. Knowledge had always been her shield. Every poisonous berry had a name. Every mushroom a purpose. Every insect a place within the ecosystem. But this, there was no field guide for people who refused to die. An hour later, they finally stopped. Not because they were safe. Because they physically couldn't continue. The climb had carried them onto a narrow granite outcrop overlooking a steep ravine. Dense forest stretched below them in every direction. Everyone collapsed where they stood. Several students sobbed quietly. One vomited from exhaustion. Another stared blankly into the trees. Evelyn counted, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Her stomach tightened. Where's Owen? Silence. She looked around again. Only 6 students. They had started with 7. Mia covered her mouth. He was behind me. I thought he was with you. No. Daniel's voice shook. He fell near the creek. Nobody answered. No one wanted to say what every person was thinking. Evelyn forced herself to remain calm. We can't go back. The words tasted like ash. Mia looked at her with disbelief. We're just leaving him. If he's alive, going back with 6 exhausted people won't save him. And if he isn't? Evelyn didn't answer. There was no answer that wouldn't hurt. As the afternoon wore on, the forest slowly regained its sounds. Birds returned. Wind rustled through the pines. A squirrel darted across a nearby log. Nature, indifferent as ever, resumed its endless cycle. The contrast unsettled Evelyn more than the attack itself. The world had not ended. Only humanity's place within it had changed. She took out her map. The nearest ranger outpost lay nearly 15 kilometers west, too far. The nearest highway was worse. If the smoke on the horizon meant what she suspected, roads would be death traps. She folded the map. We stay off every major trail. Daniel frowned. But won't rescuers use the trails? If there are rescuers. No one argued. As evening approached, clouds rolled across the mountains. Rain began as a fine mist before becoming a steady downpour. Within minutes, everyone was soaked. The temperature dropped sharply. Hypothermia would become a greater threat than hunger before morning. Evelyn scanned the terrain. A massive fallen cedar rested against a rocky slope, creating a natural overhang beneath its trunk. Over there. The students crawled underneath. It wasn't comfortable. But it was dry. Dry meant survival. Evelyn immediately assigned tasks. Collect dead branches. They are wet. Only on the outside. Confused looks met her. She picked up a broken limb and split it against a rock. The center would remain dry. Fire starts from the inside. Within 20 minutes, a small smokeless fire flickered beneath the shelter. The students watched it with something close to awe. I didn't know you could do that. Evelyn smiled faintly. Most people don't. She handed Daniel a handful of spruce needles. Tea. He blinked. We're making tea. It contains vitamin C. He managed the smallest laugh. I guess professors really do know everything. Evelyn stared into the flames. No. If she did, she would know what was happening beyond these mountains. She would know whether her parents were alive, whether her colleagues had escaped, whether civilization still existed somewhere beyond the smoke. Instead, she knew only trees, roots, rain, and the uncomfortable certainty that those things might soon matter more than anything humanity had ever built. The fire crackled softly beneath the shelter as darkness settled over the forest. Far away, carried faintly on the night wind. A scream echoed through the valley. Then another. No one slept. The rain continued through most of the night. It drummed softly against the cedar trunk above their heads, running in thin streams down the bark, before disappearing into the dark soil beneath their makeshift shelter. The fire had long since burned down to glowing embers, just enough to provide warmth without sending a column of smoke into the damp forest. No one truly slept. Every rustle of leaves made someone sit upright. Every snapping twig tightened muscles already sore from running. Evelyn remained awake, sitting near the entrance of the shelter with her back against the rough bark. A folding knife rested loosely in her handy, a half-knot because she believed it could protect them, but because it gave her something to hold. She listened, rain, wind. An owl somewhere in the distance. Nothing else for now. The first light of dawn filtered through the gray clouds. Everything smelled fresh, clean, almost peaceful. It felt wrong. Only yesterday, this same forest had been a classroom. Now it was a refuge. Evelyn quietly crawled out from beneath the fallen cedar before the others woke. The damp earth yielded beneath her boots as she climbed a nearby slope. She needed information. From the top of the ridge, she could see the valley stretching toward civilization. She raised her binoculars. The highway below had become a graveyard. Hundreds of abandoned vehicles clogged both directions. Tractor-trailers sat jackknifed across lanes. Cars had collided into tangled heaps of twisted metal. Smoke still rose from scattered fires. No movement. Not even emergency vehicles. Farther beyond, the skyline of the nearest town was obscured by a haze of dark smoke. She focused the binoculars. A supermarket parking lot. People were running. Others chased them. One person stumbled. The crowd behind engulfed them almost instantly. Evelyn lowered the binoculars. There would be no rescue convoy coming through those roads. Not today. Maybe not ever. When she returned, the students were already awake. Daniel looked up hopefully. Did you see anyone? Evelyn hesitated. Then she answered honestly. I saw enough. The silence that followed told them everything. Mia hugged her knees. So, what do we do? Evelyn looked around at their exhausted faces. They were students. Not soldiers. Not survivalists. Most had signed up for this field expedition, expecting lectures about moss and tree canopies. Now they were waiting for their professor to explain how to survive the end of the world. She took a slow breath. We stop thinking about getting home. Several faces turned toward her. We think about getting through today. The lesson began immediately. Rule 1, Evelyn said as they packed what little gear remained. Water comes before food. She led them downhill toward the sound of running water. The stream they found was narrow but fast-moving, its water tumbling over smooth granite. One student knelt to drink. No. Evelyn caught his shoulder. You never drink untreated water. But it looks clean. It only looks clean. She unpacked a stainless steel bottle, charcoal from last night's fire, clean sand, fine gravel, and a strip of cloth cut from an extra shirt. Working carefully, she layered the materials inside a hollow section of bamboo they had collected during an earlier expedition. The students watched in fascination. A simple filter removes sediment, she explained. It doesn't make water completely safe. She filled a cooking pot and suspended it over a small fire. Boiling finishes the job. Daniel frowned. You've done this before. She smiled faintly. I teach botany. He laughed. This seems like survival school. Botany is survival school. Over the next several hours, Evelyn transformed the forest into a classroom once again. Only now, every lesson carried consequences. She pointed to a cluster of bright red berries. Never eat these. Nearby, she knelt beside broadleaf plantain. This one helps reduce inflammation. She showed them cattails growing along the marsh. The roots are edible. Pine needles. Medicinal. Willow bark. Natural pain relief. Wild onions, safe, hemlock, deadly. The students filled fresh notebooks. No one complained anymore. Knowledge had become food. Knowledge had become medicine. Knowledge had become hope. By noon, clouds finally broke apart. Sunlight warmed the forest floor. For the first time since yesterday, Evelyn noticed butterflies drifting among wildflowers. Life continued. Completely unaware of humanity's collapse. The realization settled heavily inside her. Nature did not mourn civilizations. Forests had watched kingdoms rise and disappear. They would watch this one fade as well. That afternoon, they found an abandoned campsite. 2 tents stood untouched beneath towering pines. A campfire had burned itself into cold ash. Cooking pots still sat beside folding chairs. A deck of playing cards lay scattered across a picnic table, soaked by the rain. It looked as though the campers had simply stood up and walked away. Evelyn approached cautiously. No bodies. No signs of struggle. She searched every tent. Sleeping bags. Flashlights. Propane stove. Medical kit. Fishing line, axes. Extra blankets. The students stared. It's like they disappeared. No, Evelyn said quietly. They left in a hurry. She didn't say what she truly feared. That perhaps they hadn't left willingly. They divided the supplies evenly. Only what they could carry. The rest stayed behind. As they prepared to leave, Evelyn noticed something unusual near the edge of the campsite. Fresh boot prints. Far larger than any member of their group. Not infected, human, recent. Someone else was alive. She crouched beside the impression. The stride was long. Purposeful. Not wandering. Heading north. Away from the roads. Just like them. Hope flickered. Then disappeared almost immediately. If survivors were heading into the wilderness, resources would become scarce. People, she realized, might eventually become as dangerous as the infected. As evening approached, Evelyn led the group toward higher ground. From the crest of another ridge, the forest stretched endlessly before them. Green, silent, ancient. She studied the terrain with a professor's eye. Natural caves. Seasonal streams. Dense evergreen cover. South-facing slopes for winter sunlight. Rich soil if civilization truly had fallen. Then survival wasn't about tomorrow anymore. It was about years. The thought terrified her. Yet beneath the fear, another feeling quietly emerged: purpose. She had spent her life studying how ecosystems endured storms, fires, droughts, and disease. Perhaps everything she had learned had been preparing her for this. Not intentionally, but inevitably. She looked toward the endless sea of trees. Somewhere within that wilderness was a place no one would think to search. A place where food could grow. Water could be collected. Shelter could disappear beneath living branches. A place where nature itself could become a fortress. She didn't know where it was yet, but she knew how to find it. And for the first time since the outbreak began, she wasn't simply running. She was searching for a place where life could begin again. The fourth morning, after the attack arrived beneath a blanket of fog, it drifted through the trees in pale ribbons, swallowing trunks until they looked like pillars standing in a white ocean. Every branch dripped with last night's rain, and every footstep pressed quietly into the damp carpet of pine needles. Evelyn knelt beside a patch of soft earth. 6 sets of footprints, all from her group. She compared them to another set crossing the same clearing, larger, heavier. The tread was different. Military boots. Less than a day old. She brushed the print with her fingertips. Not one person. At least 3. They had moved in formation, keeping the same pace and distance between one another. Professional or disciplined, neither possibility comforted her. She covered the tracks with loose leaves before standing. We're changing direction. Daniel looked confused. We've been heading west. Not anymore. Why? We're being followed. The students immediately looked around. I don't see anyone. You wouldn't. She adjusted the straps of her pack. That's the point. They left the trail completely. Branches scraped against their sleeves as they forced their way through dense thickets where no established path existed. Travel became painfully slow. Every 100 meters required climbing over fallen logs or weaving through walls of mountain laurel. The students grew tired quickly. By midday, nobody complained anymore. Their energy was too valuable to waste on words. Evelyn paused frequently, scanning the forest ahead. She wasn't looking for infected. She was looking for signs of disturbance. Broken spiderwebs. Freshly snapped twigs. Mud displaced where someone had stepped. Nature always remembered who had passed through it. You only had to learn how to read it. Around noon, Mia caught up beside her. You think they are dangerous? I don't know. But they are people, yes. Mia seemed relieved. Evelyn wasn't. People get hungry. The younger woman frowned. So do we. Evelyn nodded. And hunger changes people. Neither of them spoke again. The afternoon sun briefly broke through the clouds. They stopped near a shallow stream to refill water bottles. As the others worked, Evelyn wandered upstream. Something caught her attention. The water wasn't flowing naturally. Several fist-sized rocks had been deliberately arranged to redirect the current. Not enough to notice from a distance. Just enough to create a quieter pool downstream. Someone had engineered it. Someone who understood water. She crouched. Beside one stone lay the remains of a fish skeleton. Cleanly filleted, recent. No more than 2 days old. Someone was living out here. Not surviving, living. She carefully restored everything exactly as she'd found it. If another survivor had gone to the trouble of hiding their work, she wouldn't expose it. She hoped they would extend the same courtesy. Late that afternoon, the wind shifted. It carried an unfamiliar scent, smoke. Not wildfire. Cooking fire, fresh. Very close. Everyone smelled it. Daniel smiled for the first time in days. Someone's alive. Before anyone could move toward it, Evelyn raised a hand. No. They stared at her. What if they help us? Mia asked. What if they don't? Silence. She looked toward the drifting smoke. Any fire this small is intentional. You think they are hiding. I know they are. And if they are hiding, they have a reason. Reluctantly, the group turned away. They never saw the people who made the fire. But someone saw them. As evening settled over the mountains, Evelyn felt it. That strange sensation of being watched. She stopped walking. The forest stopped with her. Nothing moved then. A raven burst from a nearby pine. Another followed. Both flew in the same direction. Not because of her. Because something else had disturbed them first. Someone stood somewhere beyond the trees, watching. Not approaching. Just watching. Evelyn lowered her gaze and continued walking as though she'd noticed nothing. Some encounters were survived by pretending they never happened. Rain returned after sunset. They found shelter beneath an overhanging cliff, protected from the worst of the weather. Dinner consisted of roasted cattail roots, a handful of wild onions, and trout caught earlier that afternoon using fishing line from the abandoned campsite. Nobody enjoyed the meal. But everyone finished it. Calories were calories. As darkness settled around them, Daniel finally asked the question everyone had avoided. Do you think our families are alive? The fire crackled softly. No one answered. After a long silence, Evelyn spoke. I don't know. My parents live in the city. So does my sister, Mia whispered. Another student stared into the flames. I keep thinking my phone will start working. Evelyn looked at the black screen in her own pocket. The battery had fallen below 20%. She hadn't turned it on since yesterday. She couldn't bear to watch it become another useless object. Eventually, it too would die. Like the radios. Like the internet. Like the familiar world they all belonged to. The next morning arrived cold and bright. Mist clung to the valley below, but the mountain peaks stood beneath clear blue skies. Evelyn climbed a nearby boulder for a better view. Then she saw it. Far to the north. A narrow valley hidden between two granite ridges. Almost invisible beneath an unbroken canopy of evergreen trees. A ribbon of silver reflected sunlight through the leaves. A river. The surrounding slopes were steep. Natural barriers. Limited access. Dense vegetation. Rich biodiversity. She couldn't see everything from this distance. But she saw enough. A place like that could hide someone for years. If anyone could reach it. She memorized its position against the mountains. Not now, not yet. But someday. As the group prepared to continue, Evelyn glanced one last time toward the distant valley. The wind stirred the treetops like waves rolling across a green sea. For the first time since the world had fallen apart, she wasn't searching for a road back to civilization. She was searching for a place where civilization no longer mattered. The forest no longer felt like unfamiliar wilderness. It had become a map waiting to be read. Every stream promised water. Every hillside offered shelter. Every tree concealed both danger and possibility. She adjusted her backpack and stepped beneath the towering pines. Behind her, the trail disappeared into undergrowth. Ahead lay only the wilderness. And somewhere within it, the beginning of a new life. The forest had become quieter. Not because it was empty, but because Evelyn had finally learned the difference between ordinary silence and dangerous silence. The ordinary silence came with the wind moving through pine needles, insects humming beneath fallen logs, and the occasional call of a hawk circling high above the canopy. Dangerous silence carried tension. Birds vanished. Squirrels retreated. Even the breeze seemed to hesitate before entering a place where death lingered. On the 12th morning since the outbreak, Evelyn woke before sunrise to that kind of silence. She slowly opened her eyes, careful not to disturb the bed of spruce boughs beneath her. The camp was still. Daniel and Mia slept beneath a tarp stretched between two cedars, while the remaining students rested around the dying embers of last night's fire. No one had spoken much in recent days. The initial panic had faded, replaced by the exhausting routine of simply staying alive. Evelyn listened. A twig snapped. Not close, not far. Her hand instinctively found the handle of her hatchet. She waited another minute, nothing. The forest breathed again. A robin called from somewhere uphill. Only then did she allow herself to relax. Breakfast was modest. Roasted cattail roots, dried trout, and tea brewed from pine needles. Daniel looked at the meal with a tired smile. I never thought I'd get excited over roots. You'd be surprised what hunger can teach, Evelyn replied. Mia stirred the tea with a carved stick. I miss coffee. A soft laugh circled the camp. It was the first genuine laugh in days. For a moment, they almost felt normal. Then a distant scream echoed across the valley. Everyone froze. The sound lasted only seconds before abruptly ending. No one finished their tea. By mid-morning, Evelyn decided it was time to stop wandering aimlessly. We need to think beyond tomorrow. The students gathered around as she spread a topographic map over a flat stone. We've been reacting to every problem as it comes. She traced a finger across the mountains. That keeps us alive. Her finger stopped on a cluster of ridges surrounding the hidden valley she had seen the previous day. But it won't keep us alive through winter. Daniel studied the map, so we're looking for a permanent camp. Evelyn nodded. Somewhere with 4 things. She raised one finger. Reliable water. A second. Natural shelter. A third. Soil capable of growing food. Finally, a 4th. A place difficult for both infected and people to reach. Mia frowned. Does a place like that even exist? Evelyn looked toward the distant mountains. I think it does. The journey north proved far more difficult than expected. The terrain became steeper with every kilometer. Loose shale shifted beneath their boots. Thick bramble patches forced them to cut narrow passages using camping hatchets. Several times they had to cross fallen trees, suspended over ravines where swollen streams thundered below. It was slow. Dangerously slow. But the difficult terrain also meant fewer infected. The dead followed roads. They followed noise. Very few wandered this deep into untouched wilderness. Nature itself had become a barrier. Around noon, Evelyn stopped beside a stand of young birch trees. She examined the bark carefully before making a shallow cut with her knife. Clear sap slowly emerged. The students watched curiously. She collected a small amount in a metal cup. Birch sap. Daniel tasted it. It's sweet. A little. What can we use it for? It provides water, minerals, and a small amount of natural sugar. She smiled. The forest feeds those who know how to ask. Throughout the afternoon, every stop became another lesson. She identified yarrow growing along sunny clearings. Wild garlic beneath damp soil. Medicinal moss suitable for dressing wounds. Willow bark that could ease fever and pain. Poisonous lookalikes that could kill within hours. The students listened more carefully than they ever had in a university lecture hall. Out here, every lesson carried the weight of survival. Late that afternoon, they discovered a deer carcass near a narrow creek. The animal had died recently. Its hindquarters had been stripped almost clean. Evelyn crouched beside it. No bite marks. Clean cuts. Knife work. Someone had butchered the animal. Fresh tracks surrounded the carcass, human. At least 4 individuals. They're close, Mia whispered. Evelyn nodded. Which means we'll leave. Daniel looked confused. They left food behind. They left a message. What message? This is their hunting ground. No one argued. As they moved deeper into the mountains, the forest began to change. The pines grew taller. The undergrowth thickened. Massive granite cliffs rose on either side, narrowing the valley into a winding corridor where sunlight reached the ground for only a few hours each day. Moisture lingered everywhere. Ferns carpeted the forest floor. Mushrooms emerged from rotting logs in astonishing variety. Evelyn's pace slowed. Not from exhaustion, from fascination. She recognized species she had spent years studying, but had only rarely seen in the wild. Chicken of the woods, turkey tail, lion's mane. Medicinal fungi worth entire research grants now grew freely on ancient hardwoods. For the first time since the outbreak, she felt something other than fear, wonder. The world humanity had neglected was quietly reclaiming itself. That evening, they reached a narrow waterfall, spilling over dark stone into a crystal-clear pool. The sound masked every other noise in the valley. Evelyn stood motionless. Water, rock shelter, dense forest, natural concealment. She smiled, not because this was the place, but because places like this existed. Somewhere ahead lay the refuge she had imagined. A place where she could stop running. A place where she could plant instead of gather. Build instead of flee. Survive instead of merely endure. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, she knelt beside the pool and dipped her hand into the icy water. The current flowed steadily despite the dry season, reliable, constant. Exactly what she had hoped to find. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the future no longer felt like an empty void. It felt like a project. And projects, unlike panic, could be planned. The first snowfall arrived before Evelyn found the place. It wasn't a storm, just a light dusting that settled across the forest floor overnight, whitening fallen branches and coating the moss-covered boulders in delicate frost. Every footprint became a record. Every broken twig became evidence. Winter had announced itself quietly. To Evelyn, it sounded like a deadline. She stood on a granite overlook, with chilled fingers wrapped around her binoculars. Below, an endless ocean of pines stretched across the mountains, interrupted only by ribbons of silver where streams cut through the wilderness. She had spent nearly 3 weeks searching. 3 weeks crossing valleys, climbing ridges, mapping water sources, and quietly eliminating locations that looked promising, but failed one critical test. Some valleys flooded every spring. Others offered poor sunlight for growing crops. Several contained only shallow soil over solid rock. A few were simply too easy to find. If she intended to survive for years instead of weeks, she couldn't settle for good enough. She needed a place the world itself wanted to hide. The group had grown quieter with every passing day. Conversation had been replaced by routine. Wake before dawn. Check the perimeter. Collect water. Gather food, travel, repeat. The rhythm was comforting. Predictable. Until it wasn't. Daniel approached while tightening the straps on his backpack. I found another stream. How deep? Maybe knee-high. Current, fast. She nodded, show me. The stream flowed between steep banks lined with alder trees. Unlike most mountain creeks, this one disappeared beneath a wall of limestone before re-emerging several meters downstream. Evelyn crouched at the entrance. Cold air drifted outward. Her flashlight cut through the darkness. A cave. Not large. Not deep enough still. She smiled. The mountain is full of them. Daniel looked confused. What caves? So. They're telling us we're close. The next several days became an exercise in patience. Every cave had to be inspected. Some flooded. Others were home to black bears preparing for hibernation. One contained unstable ceilings that shed loose stone whenever the wind howled outside. Another looked perfect until Evelyn discovered the only entrance faced directly into the prevailing winter wind. She rejected them all. The students couldn't understand why. This one's dry, Mia argued. It won't be after heavy rain. How do you know? Evelyn pointed toward a faint brown line running across the cave wall. Water stain. The mark sat nearly waist-high. When snow melts in spring, this room becomes a river. Mia sighed. I never would have noticed. That's why we're still looking. Food became increasingly difficult to find. The edible berries of autumn had withered. Most mushrooms had disappeared beneath frost. Fishing remained reliable, but only when the streams weren't frozen. Evelyn adapted. She taught the group how to build fish traps using woven willow branches, how to recognize squirrel food caches beneath fallen leaves, how to harvest pine nuts from cones before winter birds stripped them bare. Every lesson expanded their chances of survival. Every lesson cost precious daylight. One afternoon, while following a narrow game trail through dense spruce, Evelyn noticed something strange. The deer tracks ahead simply stopped. She frowned. Animals didn't vanish. They avoided obstacles. Carefully stepping forward, she parted a curtain of hanging vines. Behind them stood a narrow limestone cliff, almost completely concealed beneath moss and climbing ivy. At first glance it looked solid. Then she saw the shadow. An opening, barely wider than a person, hidden behind decades of natural growth. Her pulse quickened. She slipped inside. The temperature changed immediately, cool, dry, stable. The passage widened after several meters, before opening into a vast chamber. Sunlight filtered through a crack high above, illuminating dust drifting lazily through the air. A natural skylight. She slowly turned in a circle. Stone shelves. Dry floors. High ceilings. No fresh animal tracks. No flooding. No unstable rock. Only silence. For several long moments, she simply stood there. Listening, nothing. The mountain swallowed every outside sound. Even the nearby stream became little more than a whisper. She whispered one word, home. Over the following week, the cave became a construction site. The entrance remained hidden behind vines so thick that even standing a few meters away, the opening was nearly impossible to detect. Evelyn insisted on improving that camouflage instead of removing it. If someone sees fresh cuts, she explained, they'll start looking. Instead, they carefully wove living vines across a lightweight frame that could be opened from the inside, while appearing completely untouched from outside. Nature would become the front door. Inside, everyone worked. Daniel gathered flat stones for flooring. Mia cleaned years of accumulated debris from the main chamber. Others carried fallen timber from distant parts of the forest to avoid leaving obvious signs near the entrance. Every decision served two purposes: build, hide. Winter settled fully over the mountains. Snow blanketed the valley. Work became slower, harder. But each passing day transformed the cave. A stone fireplace vented smoke through a narrow crack high in the ceiling, where it dispersed among evergreen branches instead of rising in a visible column. Rainwater collected in carved channels before flowing into covered cisterns. Storage shelves lined the walls. Sleeping platforms were raised above the cold stone floor. A root cellar took shape in the coolest chamber, where food could remain edible for months. The cave no longer resembled a temporary refuge. It was becoming something else. Not merely a shelter, a system. One designed to disappear into the mountain itself. Late one evening, after the others had fallen asleep, Evelyn stepped outside. Snowflakes drifted silently through the moonlight. She looked back. The entrance had vanished. Even knowing exactly where it stood, she struggled to distinguish it from the surrounding cliff. She smiled to herself. For the first time since the world had ended, she had built something instead of fleeing from something. It wasn't finished. Far from it. The mountain still demanded months of labor before it could sustain them through years of isolation. But the foundation had been laid. The forest had given her a place to begin. And Evelyn intended to make it impossible for the world to ever find it again. Spring arrived so gradually that Evelyn almost failed to notice it. The snow did not disappear all at once. Instead, it retreated from the mountains in quiet surrender, exposing patches of damp earth where tiny green shoots pushed stubbornly toward the light. Ice loosened its grip on the streams, and the valley echoed once more with rushing water. For the first time since the outbreak, the forest smelled alive again. Standing at the entrance of the hidden cave, Evelyn breathed deeply. Nearly 2 years had passed. Not 2 years of merely surviving. 2 years of building. Every sunrise had begun with work, and every sunset had ended with planning for the next day. The mountain had become her homey a half not because it welcomed her, but because she had learned to belong to it. The cave no longer resembled the cold limestone chamber she had first discovered. It had become an underground sanctuary. The main chamber housed a stone hearth built with carefully fitted rocks that directed smoke through a series of narrow natural fissures. By the time it reached the surface, the smoke had cooled enough to disperse beneath the forest canopy, nearly invisible against the morning mist. Sleeping platforms lined one wall, raised from the cold floor with hand-hewn timber. Storage shelves held rows of glass jars filled with dried mushrooms, medicinal herbs, berries, pine nuts, smoked trout, and preserved venison. Nothing was wasted. Every empty jar became another container. Every scrap of cloth found a second purpose. The cave had grown beyond its original chamber. Months of careful excavation and adaptation had revealed smaller natural passages connecting hidden rooms. One became a pantry, where the cool, constant temperature preserved root vegetables for months. Another served as a medicinal workshop. Bundles of lavender, yarrow, chamomile, peppermint, willow bark, and countless other herbs hung from the ceiling, drying slowly in the cool mountain air. Clay pots filled with homemade salves rested neatly on carved shelves. Alcohol distilled from fermented berries had become disinfectant. Pine resin mixed with beeswax formed waterproof sealants. Years earlier, these experiments had earned Evelyn research grants. Now they kept her alive. Outside, the forest itself had become an extension of the shelter. Terraced garden beds blended seamlessly into the hillside beneath layers of native vegetation. Anyone passing overhead would see nothing more than wild growth. Hidden among the ferns grew potatoes, beans, carrots, onions, garlic, medicinal herbs, and edible greens. She never planted in straight rows. Nature rarely did. Instead, companion plants grew together as they would in untouched ecosystems. Flowers attracted pollinators. Strong-smelling herbs confused insects. Ground cover protected the soil from drying beneath the summer sun. Even the gardens had become camouflage. The greatest challenge had always been water. The nearby stream flowed reliably throughout the year, but depending solely upon it would have been dangerous. Evelyn spent months carving shallow channels into natural stone, redirecting rainwater toward underground cisterns lined with waterproof clay. During storms, every drop became stored drinking water. During dry seasons, those cisterns kept the gardens alive. The system required no pumps, only gravity. Nature did the work. Wildlife slowly returned. At first, it had been cautious. A fox appeared one evening near the stream. Weeks later came deer. Then rabbits. Birdsong filled the valley each morning. Even black bears occasionally wandered through during berry season. Evelyn never viewed them as enemies. They were indicators. When the birds suddenly vanished, something larger had entered the valley. When deer fled unexpectedly, predators were nearby. The forest spoke constantly. She had simply learned its language. Not all of her defenses were built from stone. Some were living. She planted thorny blackberry brambles along likely approaches to the cave. Within 2 years, they had formed nearly impenetrable walls. Poison ivy spread naturally across unused trails. She encouraged it. Fast-growing vines concealed old paths. Moss covered disturbed earth. Even fallen branches were repositioned to appear untouched. By the second year, the cave no longer looked hidden. It looked as though no one had ever lived there. Her warning systems were equally subtle. Rather than noisy traps that could reveal her location, she relied on the forest itself. Tiny stacks of balanced stones rested along game trails. One misplaced pebble told her someone had passed. Fine threads of plant fiber stretched across narrow passages. Broken spiderwebs marked recent movement. Specific patches of soft soil remained carefully raked each evening. Fresh footprints became impossible to miss. The mountain quietly reported every visitor. On clear days, Evelyn climbed to a concealed observation post overlooking the valley. A platform built high among several ancient pines gave her a commanding view without exposing her silhouette. From there she watched seasons pass. Spring flowers, summer storms, autumn leaves, winter snow. Years blurred together. The infected still wandered occasionally through distant valleys. Some collapsed where they walked, their bodies finally yielding to time. Others remained strangely persistent, staggering aimlessly through abandoned roads far below. She rarely encountered them anymore. Distance had become her greatest weapon. Loneliness proved harder to survive than hunger. There were evenings when she found herself speaking aloud simply to hear another voice. She read pages from her old botany notebook. She maintained journals documenting flowering dates, rainfall, wildlife behavior, and every improvement made to the shelter. Writing imposed order upon uncertainty. If someone someday discovered these journals, they would understand that civilization had not vanished overnight. It had simply been replaced, one careful habit at a time. One autumn afternoon, Evelyn stood at the edge of her hidden garden. The harvest filled woven baskets. Enough dried beans for 2 winters. Root vegetables stacked neatly inside the pantry. Medicinal herbs hanging in careful bundles. Smoked fish curing beside the hearth. Rainwater cisterns completely full. Firewood split and stored beneath covered racks. Solar batteries, scavenged months earlier, quietly charged from panels concealed among the trees. She slowly turned in a circle, the cave, the gardens, the water, the hidden paths. Everything she had imagined on that distant mountain ridge, nearly 2 years earlier now, existed. Not perfectly, but reliably. If nothing unexpected happened, she could remain here for 3, perhaps even 4 years, without needing to risk scavenging abandoned towns. The realization settled over her like the warm afternoon sunlight. She had done it, not through strength, not through violence, but through patience, knowledge, observation, and respect for the forest that had become her greatest ally. For the first time since the world had collapsed, Evelyn allowed herself a rare luxury. She sat quietly beside the stream, removed her boots, and let the cold water wash over her tired feet. The valley was silent, except for birdsong and flowing water. No screams. No gunfire. No desperate footsteps. Just the ancient rhythm of the wilderness. She closed her eyes. For a single afternoon, the apocalypse felt impossibly far away. She knew better than to believe peace would last forever. But after years of relentless labor, she had finally earned a moment to simply exist, unseen, alive, home. The first sign wasn't a footprint. It wasn't broken branches or disturbed soil. It was silence. Evelyn had learned years ago that the forest never truly stopped speaking. Birds greeted the sunrise long before the light reached the valley. Squirrels quarreled over pine cones. Insects hummed beneath the ferns. Even the wind carried different voices, depending on which trees it passed through. On this particular morning, everything stopped. She lowered the woven basket she had been filling with medicinal herbs. The robins disappeared first. Then the chickadees. Even the stream seemed louder than usual, as though nature itself had taken a breath and refused to let it go. Someone was nearby. She slowly reached into the basket, not for the herbs, but for the compact binoculars tucked beneath a folded cloth. Instead of walking toward the disturbance, she climbed. Years earlier, she had built a concealed observation platform nearly 20 meters above the forest floor, hidden within the broad crown of an ancient Douglas fir. From below, it looked like nothing more than another cluster of branches. To Evelyn, it was the safest place in the valley. She settled onto the platform, raised the binoculars, and began searching. For nearly 10 minutes, she saw nothing. Then movement. A flash of dark fabric between the trees, another. 3 figures emerged from the undergrowth, nearly 400 meters downstream. Not infected, people. They moved carefully, not like frightened travelers, not like scavengers wandering at random. Every few minutes, they stopped to observe their surroundings before continuing. One carried a rifle slung across his chest. Another held a homemade spear. The third carried an oversized hiking pack patched together from different backpacks. Evelyn watched without blinking. They weren't hiking. They were searching. One of them knelt beside the stream. Instead of drinking, he examined the muddy bank, tracking. Her stomach tightened. She followed their movements for over an hour. They spoke quietly, their words lost beneath the sound of flowing water. Their behavior revealed far more than their conversation ever could. The woman in the group repeatedly scanned the treetops. The older man studied the ground. The youngest searched rock ledges and hollow trees. Each looked in different places. Organized. Experienced. This wasn't their first search. Evelyn climbed down only after they disappeared beyond the ridge. The moment her boots touched the ground, she abandoned every task planned for the day. Harvesting could wait. Repairs could wait. Security came first. She walked every hidden trail leading toward the shelter. At each one, she erased footprints using bundles of evergreen branches. Fresh tool marks disappeared beneath scattered leaves. Wheelbarrow tracks from moving firewood were broken apart with pine needles. Nothing remained that suggested someone lived here. Then she reached the entrance. Hidden beneath curtains of ivy and moss, it looked exactly as it had on the day she first discovered it. Almost. She noticed a single vine had been bent outward. Only slightly. Enough to escape notice by almost anyone. Not by her. Someone had brushed against it. Someone had stood less than a meter from her front door. That evening, she did something she had hoped never to do. She opened a sealed wooden chest stored beneath the stone floor of the pantry. Inside rested carefully wrapped notebooks, maps, seeds collected over years, dried medicinal samples, her university research, personal journals documenting every improvement she had made since the outbreak. The story of her survival. She divided everything into two piles. Essential. Replaceable. If she had to leave, she could not carry her entire life. Only its most important pieces. Over the next 3 days, the strangers returned. Always from different directions. Always searching. Never finding. Evelyn observed them from hidden vantage points, slowly building a picture of who they were. There were 6 in total. Not soldiers. Not raiders, families. 2 older adults. 3 younger men. 1 teenage girl who looked barely 16. They appeared exhausted. Clothing hung loosely from shrinking bodies. Every meal seemed uncertain. She recognized the look. She had worn it herself during the first winter. They weren't evil. They were desperate. And desperate people were unpredictable. On the 4th morning, the youngest man found one of her oldest decoys. Years earlier, Evelyn had constructed a false shelter beneath an overhanging rock nearly a kilometer from the cave. A collapsed lean-to. Old ashes. Broken cooking pots. Discarded cans scavenged from abandoned camps. It looked abandoned for years. The group spent nearly the entire day searching the area. From her observation platform, Evelyn watched them dismantle every branch, inspect every footprint, and probe every crevice. The false camp had worked exactly as intended. Until the teenage girl looked uphill, toward the real valley. She frowned. Then she pointed. The others followed. They couldn't see the cave, not yet. But they had noticed something. A line of greener vegetation fed by water from Evelyn's hidden irrigation channels. Subtle. Almost invisible, almost. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. Instead, she packed. The emergency pack had always waited near the rear tunnel. 3 days of food, seeds, medicinal herbs, maps, water purification equipment, essential tools. Everything weighed less than 20 kilograms. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for years. Now it had arrived. Not because the infected had found her. Because people had. Just before dawn, voices echoed through the forest. Closer than ever before. They've been here. I know it. Keep looking. Evelyn extinguished the last ember in the fireplace. She covered the ashes with cold stone dust. Every surface inside the cave had already been cleaned. Nothing remained except what she intended them to find. A shelter, empty, as if its owner had vanished months ago. She stepped into the narrow escape tunnel carved through the mountain's natural fissures. The passage twisted downward before emerging hundreds of meters away, beneath a fallen cedar hidden by dense ferns. She looked back only once. The cave had been her home. It had also become a risk she could no longer afford. The forest had taught her one lesson above all others. Nothing in nature lasts forever. Not flowers. Not seasons. Not safe places. Survival belonged to those willing to adapt. She disappeared into the trees, just as distant voices reached the concealed entrance. By the time the strangers uncovered the hidden sanctuary, Evelyn was already a shadow moving through the wildernessy, a half lighter by the weight of the home she left behind, but richer with the knowledge that no one could take what mattered most. They could occupy her shelter. They could harvest her garden. They could sleep beside her hearth. But they could never claim the years of patience, observation, and resilience that had built it. As the morning sun rose over the mountains, the forest quietly closed behind her. It erased her footprints with falling needles. It carried away her scent on the wind. Within hours, it was as though she had never been there at all. The wilderness had accepted her once before. Now it welcomed her again.